Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, COVID-19 Stress Tests, Lessons from the Middle East and the Northern Africa region. So my name is Loïc Lemarois, and I'm a marketing manager here at Headspring. This webinar is intended to be interactive. We want to hear from you. So please do send in your questions, send in your comments by using, there's a Q&A here on the side on the GoToWebinar app. We'll be answering those questions during the webinar, but as well, we'll have maybe 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So please do send in your questions. We'll make sure to reply to them. So today, I'm here with Bassem Bana. He is the head of Headspring for the Middle East region. Bassem, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks Loïc, and thanks everyone for joining. I want to thank you all for attending this session today, and I hope everybody is keeping safe and healthy under these unfortunate circumstances. For the one that who don't know us, we're the joint venture between the Financial Times and IE Business School. And basically, we're founded on the principle that executive education and executive learning need to be collaborative, relevant, and most importantly, measurable. As a unique kind of joint venture, we bring the academic excellence of IE Business School, and we blend it with the journalistic approach from the Financial Times. And together we can able to design this kind of learning journeys that help executives and leaders make better decisions. Basically, since January, and as a quick response to the lockdowns, we dedicated our resources and our expertise to really help our clients and the entire community to navigate through these kind of uncertainties. IE Business School is currently ranked among the top 10 business schools around the world, and recently the #1 of online MBA. So this gives us, the possibility to act fast and leverage our online capabilities and tools to support you in that situation. For that, we have developed learning journeys that contain resources, webinars, and insights that are carefully selected to target mainly your teams, your leaders, and the C-suite of the organization. So as you can see from that slide, that's mainly open for public, and it's you can able to use it as you please across the organization. So keep track around the latest updates from webinars, topics, and insights that are listed on that learning journeys. As part of these open learning journeys, we have prepared for you this session today to discuss what has the COVID-19 experience taught us specifically about the economic resilience and exposure in our region, in the Middle East and Africa region. Joining us today from Dubai, Dr. Sami Mahroom, one of our global educators in Headspring, policy experts, and currently Director of Research and Strategy at the Dubai Future Foundation. Thanks for joining us, Doctor.
Thank you, Bassem.
Thank you. Also, we are joined from Frankfurt by Claire Jones. She's the FT journalist covering the global economy and writes about the intersection of economies, politics, and market from a global perspective. Thanks for joining us, Claire.
No problem. Really nice to be here.
We're very much excited about this session, and I think everybody are welcome to share and ask questions as much as possible. And we'll make sure also the content that is delivered through the session is very much focused towards our region here, and make sure to have the comparison between the local and also the global exposure and how the situation has been affected. Before further ado, I hand over the mic to Dr. Sami to kick off the sessions, and good luck.
Thank you, Bassem. Again, I'm Sami Mahroom, Director of Research and Strategy at the Dubai Future Foundation. For those of you who might be familiar with the organization, we've been quite busy monitoring the way that the COVID-19 crisis has been playing itself out in the UAE, but also across the world, and producing some policy briefs for the senior leadership in the country around this crisis. So I do have 15 minutes to walk through to walk you through some of the dynamics of this crisis in the MENA region. It's the 15 minutes will not be enough to go into the details of the data and to ask too many questions about that, but I think it would be good enough just to give some insights into how this public health crisis that converted into an economic crisis is affecting the region. So when we talk about the COVID-19 crisis, we're really talking about the lockdown crisis. It's in the first place a public health crisis with a huge human life lost cost and a huge cost on the healthcare service for sure. But there's as now we know, there's a much higher socioeconomic cost emanating from the lockdown that was necessary to contain the pandemic. So the lockdown is a problem because it affects the mobility of people and things. And when we talk about the mobility of people and things, we're talking trade, travel, tourism, and also we're talking production. So because people couldn't go to work anymore, and in those category of jobs where you couldn't work from home, that meant an absolute decline in productive activity. So my colleague Loic is in charge of the slides. I have no control over them, so I would have to continue to ask him to kindly move from one slide to another. So because we're talking about the lockdown and its effect on mobility, tourism obviously will be one important thing to talk about, especially vis-a-vis the region. Trade represents almost 75% of the GDP across the MENA region, and then of course when there's little mobility, little moving of people and things, and severely reduced production activity around the world, the demand for oil and gas would also decline. And then we have what we call the perfect storm in the Middle East. We have a huge drop of in the price of in demand for oil, and then almost utter stoppage of tourism and big slowdown in international trade. So Loic, next slide, please. So here we can get a picture about what does the Middle East or the MENA region trade with the world. We used to be mostly about fuels, but in the last 2 decades or so, we have managed to diversify our trade portfolio. Now we are less dependent on fuel. That's looking at the MENA in general. Of course, the oil exporting countries remain quite heavily dependent on fuel, and within these oil exporting economies, governments in particular depend anywhere between 75% and 95% of the revenues on the windfall that they get from oil and gas. Next slide. So this is quite recent from the World Bank. It gives us an idea about how different economies in the region are affected by the collapse of the oil price, and there are no surprises there. The oil exporting countries have all faced a severe reduction in their revenues. Those who don't export oils, at least they have been less affected by it directly. Of course, their energy cost goes down, which is a good thing. But as we'll see later, there's a trickle-down effect that also make them suffer from the drop in the price of oil and gas. Loic? So this is how it usually works. So there's a global demand, mostly from China when it comes to this region. China is the main buyer of our oil. There's a global demand for oil, which translates into revenues, into government budgets, and then governments spend this money on various infrastructure, but also social expenditures, investments, which leads to the creation of jobs and or the destruction of jobs when the price of oil goes down. So the things that, as things stand today, and as you all know, there has been a significant drop in demand for oil and gas, which translated into lower prices, which again trickle down into smaller revenues for governments. And now we are beginning to witness the effect of that in terms of job destruction in the oil exporting countries. Next. Just a quick look at when you put that in mind, two questions come to mind depending on where you sit and which industry you are in. If you happen to be in a business that supply government with a service or with a good, especially in oil exporting or oil reliant governments, then you are under obviously you are under a lot of stress because as we have all seen so far, there's budget freeze, there's stoppage of any new contracts on procurement, on hiring across the board. This applies also if you happen to be a worker in the public sector in an oil exporting economy, mostly the GCC, Algeria, but also Libya. Even to date, there haven't been any announcements about job cuts in the public sector, but the ghost of that is hovering up in the air, and there is fear that should the lockdown continue longer, there might have to be at least a drop in a pay cut in the public sector, in public sector jobs. I'm trying to race with the time, so please nudge me if my time is. Let me just check quickly here. Okay, yeah. So already a bit late. I can tell, but we can move a little bit faster. Next slide, Louis. So a good indicator of the level of dependency on oil revenues is through government spending is the size of government in the economy. So yes, in this chart we see that the size of government in Lebanon is slightly bigger than the one in the UAE, but the government of Lebanon is less reliant on revenues from oil than the government in the UAE. So it's a much bigger problem in the UAE than it is in Lebanon, at least in the first in the first order of fact. Let's move to the next slide. Public sector employment is huge in most GCC countries, but particularly so in Saudi Arabia, and we've just seen the announcement yesterday about the cut already in some of the perks and privileges that the public sector workers have in that country. And as I said earlier, we might expect more of that to come across the GCC region and other oil reliant countries. Next. So in the second order effects for those countries like Egypt, the Levant, that's Lebanon, Jordan, Syria is at war now. It's on different dynamics. There's a trickle down effect on these because these countries very much depend on investment from the Gulf region and on the remittances that they receive from their expatriate community in the GCC. Whenever there is a crisis like the one we're going through today, even though it's quite unique crisis, it's quite severe one, there's a trickle down effect on these economies too. Next slide. So if you happen to be in the real estate business in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Jordan, selling mostly catering to the diaspora of to the diaspora in the Gulf region, then you would be feeling the effect of the COVID-19 crisis and the drop in the price of oil as hard as if you were based in the GCC countries. So we've witnessed this in Lebanon, but also elsewhere in the region. A drop in remittances means less business deals in the property market in these countries, but also even though the season is still early, the expectation is that there will be very few tourists coming from the GCC into Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt because of the reduced purchasing power. North Africa is slightly different. Morocco and Tunisia tend to receive more remittances from Europe than from the GCC. So so there will be more exposed to what's happening in Europe as opposed to what's happening in the GCC. Next slide, Louis.
Can I intervene
So this,
the question here, Dr. Sami? You mentioned great points about the job and how jobs are affected currently with the situation, and also from the government perspective. But as we noticed that the region, specifically here, they launched lots of stimulus, billions of dollars to support economies. How do you think this will play a role in at least maintaining the situation, or where it is going to be spent on? As a priority for the region?
So it depends on how the stimulus was designed. For instance, in the UAE, the central bank gave the banks money to lend industry. But as we've seen, industry have been reluctant to make use of these extensions of these facilities because simply the demand, the business isn't actually there. So some businesses have made use of that to keep some of their stuff on payroll, but that hasn't been a requirement from the central bank. There was no condition that you have to keep people on payroll to benefit from the stimulus. So there is a major demand shock that has made businesses in the region rather reluctant to go into debts. But the stimulus so far is being really offered in the terms of credit lines to struggling businesses. So if I go back to the slide, this is just a quick panorama or overview over the dependency on remittances. So all these countries that are highly dependent on remittances from the GCC will be severely affected by the drop in the price of oil and gas. Those that have the diaspora mostly in Europe would be less exposed to the oil and gas market. Next. So we can apply the same principle on almost any industry. Okay, your market concentration, where do your clients reside, in which sector they are, and how dependent and reliant are you on one single source of export, or in case your market is domestic but your supply chain is international, how dependent or reliant are you on a producer or supplier that is in China or in Europe, in the US, for this matter, that is currently under a lockdown. Let's just move a little bit quicker because I'm aware of I'm a bit cautious of time. So tourism is one big fast-growing export sector in this region. In 2018, we received more than 87 million visitors, divided between North Africa and the Middle East. Next. We would see here that a major severe impact is felt in these cities and countries that are hugely reliant on tourism, like where I am right now at Dubai. So if you happen to be in the travel and tourism sector, you'll be very exposed. And then even if you're not directly employed or operating in that sector, if you are in retail in a place that depends on tourists, then you would also be equally affected by the reduction of business in this sector. Next. Here's just a very quick again overview on dependency on this sector. We see the smaller economies, Jordan, Lebanon, and very dependent on it in terms of employment and contribution to GDP. Next. UAE is in terms of dollar value, it's one of the biggest recipients of foreign exchange of dollars from the tourism sector. Next. Dubai, within the UAE, Dubai would be the main destination of tourists into the country, but also in the region, receiving around 18 million visitors a year, spending around 28 billion US dollar. As we know, this year, probably more than half of that will be wiped out. Our question here is how reliant are you on international tourism? I looked at figures from France. 75% of their tourists tend to be domestic. So one would argue that in the case of France, there's less exposure to the crisis in this sector than a country like the UAE, next door Oman, for instance. 50% of its tourism is domestic tourism. So arguably, it's also less affected. GCC in general, they receive more tourists from Asia. Egypt, the Levant, North Africa, they receive more tourists from Europe. Lebanon receives more tourists from the Americas than Asia, but those usually tend to be immigrant Lebanese in the Americas visiting home. Correct. So we can. So in terms of trade, the trade portfolio remains concentrated because mostly of the oil and gas. Intra-regional trade. Next, intra-regional trade is remains weak, but in the Levant, it's quite high. And there's a lot of trade between the GCC and the Levant countries, again, which would be impacted negatively because of the COVID-19 impact on the oil prices. The question of stress test here is how concentrated is your trade? How dependent are you on one particular market or region? And in terms of production and service provision, how dependent, how concentrated is your supply chain? A country like Lebanon imports everything. For example, is very much exposed to suppliers elsewhere. So this is quick data overview. Again, just shows the importance of Asia for the region, less so for the Maghreb countries who are more integrated into European economies. Again, Lebanon is more integrated within the region as a small country that tends to export a lot to the GCC. Next. So this is just to show you, just again, quick overview on about the increase of level of trade, the participation in global trade from countries in the region, but services remain low. Digitalized intangible services, we don't have complete data on these, but we can speculate under the category such as goods-related services, other services, commercial services in general. They remain weak, and hence the bulk of trade is in commodities and manufactured goods. Next. So this is just a quick summary for the oil and gas sector. We have to watch out for what's happening in China. That's where we have to look at. For tourism, we have to watch out what's happening in China, but also in Europe and in India. India is an important source of tourists for the GCC. For countries who rely on remittances, what's happening in the GCC, in the EU will be important. The Suez Canal, the Jebel Ali port, the Dubai airport, will have to continue to look at what happened in China. When it comes to government revenues, of course, we depended again on China and Europe. So this region is very much dependent on China and the EU. Most of its trade in services and goods, but also its supply chain reside in these two regions between China and the EU. This is just a table to show which countries are exposed to which industries the most. Oil and gas, it's obvious the GCC plus Algeria, and as I said, Libya, but Libya has a war going on, so it has other problems to worry about. Dubai, Egypt, the Levant, the Maghreb countries will be affected severely, much exposed to the tourism sector. Remittances, that will be the Levant, Egypt, and the Maghreb countries. Transport logistics, it would be UAE and the Suez Canal, Egypt. Again, government remittances and government revenues impact on remittances and everything else in the GCC countries, but also for the public sector employment, which is quite high. So I don't know how well I did time-wise, and in being able to share with you this content without having control over the slides flow myself. But thank you for your attention. I will be happy to take some more questions, but I'll leave the floor to Claire now to give us the global picture.
So thanks a lot for that, Sami. That was a great overview of what's going on in the Middle East and North Africa. I feel a lot more knowledgeable about the situation now personally in those countries. What I'm going to do is zoom out a little bit and look at what economists are saying about what's happening at the global level. Now, to begin with, I want to make a characterization about economists as a profession. They tend to like predicting the future. They seem to think they've got some sort of crystal ball where they can really say what's going to happen to things with quite a high degree of certainty. It's a hallmark of the profession, no matter how badly some would see them as getting it wrong in the 2008 crisis and failing to predict that. It hasn't really deterred a lot of them. So what do economists think is going to happen? Now, what I think is surprising here is that a lot of them are genuinely saying, we don't know. If you look at the range of forecasts out there about the economic damage that we're going to see from the pandemic, they really are great. And I think in the first stages of this, what we saw from the official sector was that we had a sense that, you know, I think it was best characterized by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, when they unrolled their first package of stimulus to fight the pandemic. The view was that they wanted to come up with these measures to keep every business that was viable before the pandemic in business during it, so that once the pandemic went away, you would see a jump in demand and you'd see what economists would term as a V-shaped recovery. Now, the longer this has gone on, the more protracted it's been, the more serious it's become, the fewer people are really predicting that. I'll come back later to what they're saying about the shape of the recovery, but I think a thing to emphasize from the start is this is really unprecedented in scale. Loic, can we just go back a slide, please? So what I want to show you here is the front page of the New York Times. So I think what they've done is, like, it's great here because it's just an illustration that gets to just the scale of what we're seeing and how unprecedented it is. So we're now looking at job losses in the US that far exceed the situation as it was in the Great Depression. And what's also unique is that, you know, over the Great Depression or over the Great Financial Crisis, we saw the job losses mount up over a period of months or over the quarters. What we're seeing here is something very, very dramatic. We're seeing this spike, and I just think this front page is really an excellent illustration of this. They've always separated the front page into 6 slots, and the importance here is really that they've done away with the structure that they normally have, where they usually have text in the 6th column, to really emphasize the point of just how grave the scale of the job losses we're seeing in the US is. Can we go to the next slide now, please, Loic? Thank you. So, and this is the situation on the other side of the Atlantic in the UK. These are the Bank of England's projections that came out, I think it was last week. As you can see, we haven't seen an annual fall in growth of the magnitude that they now expect since the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century. So we've never seen anything like this in modern times. This is for the annual measure, so this is minus 14% of GDP annually. They think in the first half of the year it could fall as much as 30%. So I really can't emphasize enough just how great the scale of this is in terms of the sort of like the quarterly figures, but also the annual figures. However, can we just move on to the next slide now, please, Loic? So, however, if you were looking at financial markets, you might not know it. So we've got all of this data coming through from the real economy, the PMIs that say activity's fallen by its like sharpest amount ever on record, but we've seen this bounce. So what this chart looks at is what's happened in bear markets in general, how long the recovery's taken, what happened during the Great Depression, which is this light blue kind of turquoise line, and then we've got the reaction to the pandemic on this dark blue line. So we saw this very, very rapid drop, and then we've seen it leap up. Now, what explains that leap up when we're getting such bad data on the real economy and when there's so much uncertainty? We're dealing with an unprecedented phenomenon here. We don't know. We don't have all the answers on this virus. We don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know if we're going to get second waves or not. We don't really. I mean, we're coming out of lockdowns now, but we don't know if we're going to have to go back into them because there's quickly going to be a second wave. So there's lots of unanswered questions. So why do you have this certainty in markets that you will get some sort of bounce back? Now, I don't think it's possible to answer this question completely, but there are a few things worth bearing in mind. One is the aggressiveness of the fiscal response and the monetary response. What we've seen is central banks and fiscal authorities across the world really come out with very, very strong measures that essentially bridge the gap between where we are now and normalcy. So we've seen in the UK, for instance, the government say they're going to pay 80% of people's wages who have to be furloughed. We're seeing similar measures announced in places like Germany. We've seen central banks essentially say, like, hey, we will buy, up pretty much anything. We've now got a situation where the US Federal Reserve is saying they'll buy junk bonds. So while the scale of the crisis has been unprecedented, the response has too. So I think having trillions of dollars and euros and pounds of liquidity flowing in from the central banks has really helped. And just as well, the degree of the fiscal stimulus and the degree and scale of the kind of bridging measures, I'd call them, rather than stimulus per se. Perhaps bridging measures is a better term to get us back to normal, has helped soothe market confidence. What you could also be seeing is markets thinking that all of this injection of cash from governments and central banks is going to somewhere down the line lead to inflation, and stocks are a pretty decent hedge against inflation historically, so that could be what's stimulating the stock market too. But really, I think we have to wait and see. It just seems to be the case that markets are very bullish, particularly in tech stocks, with not a lot of data in the real economy to really back that up. So if we can just move on to the next slide, we can see that, even if we start to look at stocks in the US from an earnings perspective, we can see that historically the mood is still very bullish. If you look at the price to earnings ratios here of the S&P 500, they're signaling a bullish mood, which seems a little bit insane when you look at what's going on in the real economy and when you look at the degree of uncertainty out there. So I think the real question now is, who's right? Are the markets right to have this confidence? Are we actually going to see a V-shaped recovery, or are we going to see something more equivalent to, say, a Nike swoosh? So if we can just move on to the next slide. So this is an idea that seems to have taken effect. So as the weeks and months have rolled on and the cases have mounted and the deaths have mounted and places have had to keep quite in some places in Europe, very severe lockdown measures, people have thought, we're not going to see a V-shaped recovery. We're going to see something more equivalent to a Nike swoosh, where we get a plunging growth and then we only, start to see a slower rise in GDP. Now, there are some people that are even more pessimistic and think the demand shock has been so bad, and it's been coupled with a supply shock too, just because of the reliance on global value chain and so many places really being shut for business and so few people being able to work, that you'll actually get such a bad demand shock that you'll start to see destruction on the supply side. And if you start to see that destruction on the supply side, then growth just isn't really going to come back to where it was. So some people think you'll get a very sharp sort of like U-shaped recovery, where the economy kind of bottoms out at a very low level, where you get, firms going bust, you get lots of restructurings where firms become smaller, you get lots of industries such as like airlines basically having to like wipe out parts of their stock. So you get this U-shape, and you only really kind of like get a turn up several years from now. The other forecast that some people have is a W-shaped recovery, and I think the rationale there would be that we don't know how this virus works fully. We don't know if we're going to get a massive second wave and we're going to need to do a lockdown again, in which case you'd see demand plunge again, and then at some point come up. There's actually a poll question where I want you, the listener, to decide what shape you think the recovery is going to be. So if people wouldn't mind providing their answers to that, that would be great. In terms of how businesses think it will be, there is the view from businesses is really that am I still here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can just go on to the last slide. For some reason my screen has disappeared. Sorry, it's back now. If we can just go on to the final slide, this is what businesses themselves think in the UK. So this is a cumulative chart. What it's showing is that kind of broadly, you know, about 50% of businesses think we'll be back to normal within 3 months of coming out of lockdown. But you've also got this, you know, this quite substantial tail really that thinks it's going to take a lot longer. I still think even when you're looking at this on the individual level, so much has changed that, you know, I think businesses are a lot better able to guess what their future is going to be than economists, but still the heightened degree of uncertainty would make me think that even with a chart like this, even though it kind of supports, I think, the swoosh case, it kind of looks like an inverted swoosh, if you like, it might not turn out to it might turn out to be worse than that. So after stressing all this uncertainty, you know, what can we say that we do know is going to happen at the global level? I think we do know that there's going to be a lot more debt. Fiscal deficits are going to balloon, and there's going to be a lot more private debt too. I think one thing that you are going to see because of that is something that my colleague Martin Wolf emphasized in a video produced this morning, which was that you are likely to see higher tax rates to compensate for this. He also thinks that you're going to see a lot higher tax rates for the rich, and you're going to see something of a redrawing of a social contract, that the sorts of social aspects of how economies were structured that was starting to feed into populism is going to lead to a revamp of tax systems, and you are going to start to see higher taxation of the rich. Now, I'm not sure about that, but I do think that the point on fiscal deficits and on private debt is worth remembering. We are going to get a much more highly indebted economy coming out of this. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. That's very interesting to see the different ways of going back to normal, if we're going to say it. But my question here to you in terms of, you know, the recovery time per se. So if we look to the actual vaccinations that everybody is now looking for, and I think that's what most people are basically depending on, so they can at least resume some of the normalities before. And that would automatically impact the markets and the economies, and people are able to spend a little more. So how, in terms of timeline, so you shared in terms of different scenarios, but in terms of timeline, how do you correlate this to the actual people that they are confident in terms of going back to normal? Is it something going to be related 100% to finding the vaccine, or just creating some strict measures in terms of how we gonna travel in the future, how we gonna go into, you know, big spaces? How do you envision that from your experience?
I think that's an excellent question. I think there are a few strands to it, really. I think there was a kind of a hope that I think has proven false, that a lot of people were going to now have antibodies after this initial period. But when you've seen tests even in very kind of like highly areas where the proliferation of the virus was very highly concentrated, such as North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, it seems that still less than a fifth of the population have antibodies there. We also don't know how long these antibodies last. So really, for a full return to normalcy, you are going to really need to see vaccinations. I'm not an expert on the science, But from what I've read, the timelines people seem to be talking about is around 18 months is kind of like, would be very good progress, with the proviso that sometimes you can never create a vaccine, and also that these things can take an awful lot longer. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that. But I would also say that my sense of the scientific community on this is that there has been a lot of effort to work very, very quickly, and there's been a lot of effort on the part of governments to really allow trials to start very, very quickly too. So I'm relatively optimistic that those sort of timelines that they're talking about in 18 months could be reached. Now, will it take 18 months for a full return to normal? I mean, I think that it depends on what your view of people is, really. I mean, are you going to get to a point where people think this is not something that kills 1 in 2 people that get it? The proportion of people who get this disease and are very seriously affected by it is relatively small. So are you going to get a situation where people just get so fed up and think, oh well, I'm going to take my chances, I need that holiday, I'm going to fly, and does that therefore lead to so much pressure on governments that they feel as though they have to ease lockdowns and just put in requirements like everyone who gets on a plane has to wear a mask and so on and so forth? There does seem to be a lot of protests arising. We're seeing it in Germany, for instance, where people are saying we don't want to be locked down anymore, which would signal that you would start to see a return to kind of normal behavior quite soon, and people wouldn't be daunted in going on airplanes or going into cafes or restaurants. However, the kind of flip side of that is what you're seeing in Sweden, where even though a lot of places aren't locked down, where you can go to a cinema, where you can go to a restaurant, the economic hit has still been really pretty bad. I talked to someone from Sweden and they said, even though cinemas can in theory sell 50 tickets, one of their friends went and there's only 3 people in the whole cinema. People just don't want to go because of that fear factor. So I think it's very tricky to tell. But my suspicion is a full return to normalcy doesn't happen until we have a vaccine.
Absolutely, that's basically what also in the region here, what we're finding is some of the countries are easing even the lockdowns, but also you're seeing from people that they don't have the full confidence yet to start going back to normal and going to to the spending behavior that they had. So I believe that would have a bigger impact on the spending behavior as well for individuals. That takes me to question.
I just wanted to mention in reference to what Claire ended her talk with regarding the increase in taxes. Now, I know that lots of European countries already have a very high tax burden, so they have little space to increase it. But here in the region, we've again, Saudi Arabia yesterday announced an increase of the VAT tax from 5% to 15%. Which is, I mean, 5 years ago, this was quite unheard of. So I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see that being rolled out across the GCC at least, which historically, been known for being a tax-free environment, at least income tax-free environment. So I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see tax rates increasing worldwide, but also being introduced here in the region to cope with the ramifications of the COVID-19 crisis.
What do you think would be
Sorry.
I mean, what do you think would be like the kind of social reaction to that, where you've got VAT, which is quite a regressive form of taxation in a lot of ways, in that it hurts poorer people the most relative to their income? I mean, would that be socially viable or not?
We have to see, but we also know that they're quite pragmatic here. If they sense that there's a backlash or a risk of it, they might quickly just kill it again and eliminate it. With regards to how soon we will get get out of a demand shock or get people to go out again, I saw a piece of statistics yesterday circulated by the company Statistica based on a survey in the US. I think they surveyed around 700 people or so. So it's a small sample, and there are around 55% of respondents said that they will feel comfortable going to a restaurant or a movie or back to the gym. So at least that may give us some indication of the level of the risk. Maybe we will be living in a 55% economy as opposed to the 9% economy that the economists talked about last week. But maybe this is how we will begin, and then it will grow into a 90% until there's a vaccine or something, or a test.
Yeah. I mean, it's just how viable that is really as well, because I mean, if you think, I don't know about gyms, but with restaurants, I mean, I think they've got to be 80% full to break even. A lot of these restaurants in, say, somewhere like London, where the rent is high. So it's just, you know, how long can those businesses hang on for, and how much does the state want to say, oh, we want to support that business, or we'll kind of die.
Exactly. One more question, and I think we still have 5 minutes to go, and that's for you, Sami, specifically for the Middle East. So we've seen before, like in 2019, 18, we see lots of push towards digital transformation from organization, especially driven by the governments as well. And everybody we're talking to eventually going into some sort of a digital kind of transformation. How do you see this now affecting organizations that's still a little bit lagging before you know, going really full to digitize their business, taking into consideration that, you know, in the last 3 months, basically, you know, everything moved online, and some governments in the region even, you know, struggles to some extent to really, they weren't really set up for such a scenario. How do you see this fast forwarding that process, and what that might look like from the government perspective and for organizations?
Yeah, no, indeed. It's, I mean, you make very good observations. So historically, there's been a lot of focus on automating the supply chain. So like, you know, warehouses, factories, both from China to here, okay, the logistical part of it. But now with the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen a rush by businesses to automate what I would call demand chain. You know? So the ability for consumers to reach out to suppliers directly via digital channels or digital platforms, wherever that's possible. Now, obviously, you cannot consume everything over digital platforms, but indeed, there has been a rush to extend these, to invest in these, both to allow your workers to go back to work and do as much as possible of that through remote working, but also for vis-a-vis your consumers. You see a lot of small shops, small businesses now making themselves available online, including sometimes like Michelin star restaurants or hot cuisine, who usually wouldn't even think about offering their services online. Now you can order food from a Michelin star restaurant, for instance, and get it delivered. At least the idea is there, but I see around me here in Dubai, at least, that a lot of the hot cuisine restaurants are now also offering delivery on an app, on Zomato or Deliveroo or whatever. So yes, there's been acceleration in that shift, and I think we will see more and more of that. The government for sure has signaled that working from home is here to stay. That they might actually adopt it as a permanent way of working.
Absolutely, absolutely, definitely. The things gonna change dramatically, and I think we, you know, very like adaptable. We're gonna be adaptable eventually, and emerge much more aware about, you know, everything that goes around in the future. I don't know if we still have time, Loic, or that's for a wrap up.
I think we're a little bit over time. It was a very interesting session. Thank you very much, Sami, Claire, Bassem, for participating. And as well, thank you all of you who has joined. I hope you found that interesting as well. So we'll be sending actually a recording in the next hour, so if you want to rewatch it. And as well, we will send you the links to the learning journey that Bassem mentioned. So please have a look. And I wish you all a great day. Please be safe. Sami, Claire, Bassem, thank you again for joining.
Thank you,
have a great day.
Thanks, Claire.
Bye.
Thanks.
It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Cheers.